project in Manchester is a project connecting to the NGET network. It's basically next door. There's no infrastructure required, but there's a small amount of transmission assets that we'd have to own as a private network. And our Secretary of State submission has gone in to say, look, we've got a net that we can build out. We can connect to data centre, renewables, battery, OCGT, and also serve smaller local industrial customer connections like electric HGV hubs. So it's essentially a gigapark. But the idea is, if we own that network, we can build this quicker and more cost effectively and adopt slightly different technical standards to enable those connections. And we think it's quite innovative. It's quite unique because there's no infrastructure work required. We have the land, we have the customers, we have the local support of the local MP, engagement with GMCA as an example, and all the stars have aligned for that project to proof of concept that actually we can do this as an industry.
Welcome to the Connectology podcast. I'm Hugh Taylor, CEO here at Road Knight Taylor, and in these episodes, our grid connection specialists, the Connectologists, dive into the evolving grid connections landscape, often taking expert guests with them in order to discover, generate, and share insights that might just help you and maybe even industry as a whole to connect projects faster, at lower risk, and at lower cost.
Hello and welcome to another Road Knight Taylor Connectology podcast. I'm Pete Aston, one of the engineers here at Road Knight Taylor, and I'm joined by my colleague Alex Ikonic and Spencer Thompson from Eclipse. So welcome.
Thanks, Alex, Peter. Great to be here.
Nice to have you. Now, this is the second session that we're running with sort of various key industry players on the subject of demand connections and sort of all the complexities that are sort of really coming out of the woodwork around those. But before we get into the meat of that discussion, can you just sort of give us a quick introduction to Eclipse and then your role within the business?
Yeah, so I'm the CEO of Eclipse Power Limited, which is the group entity, if you like. We're owned by a fund that's managed by the Octopus Group, so that's the affiliation, and we're able to kind of reach into the Octopus Group to help on various different aspects in the industry. But the core of Eclipse is the ID&O business that operates all around England, Wales and Scotland. We have a private networks business called Eclipse Power Optimise, which also includes microgrids, which is a real interesting technical challenge for the industry. And we also have a grid consultancy called Eclipse Power Solutions, when you know some of my colleagues. And recently we've been testing our thinking and exporting the model into Europe as well to see if we can solve similar grid problems. Because we're all industry people at heart and we love trying to come up with innovative ways to connect to the grid. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. So when looking at sort of this demand connection space, and I guess demand connections have, I guess, historically been at distribution level, but we're seeing a lot more of them now in the queue, certainly at transmission level. What are you seeing in Eclipse as some of the key problems that are starting to sort of come out and present themselves?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think, firstly, this is a bit like connections reform brewing away in the background. So all the renewables that have been building up over the last few years, we're now at the heart of the storm of connections reform, as you're very well aware. I think our challenge now as an industry is you've got the same kind of thing happening with data centres and with other large demand customers. And as an industry, we need to find ways to meet that demand and connect. The key challenges are grid capacity. The key challenges are being able to deliver to the timelines that they need. And you've got a growing queue every day. And how do we solve that as an industry? Hopefully more speedily than the connections reform. And the challenge is also for UK PLC. We're all, different maybe from renewables. We're actually competing with the rest of Europe. So how can the UK be attractive for data centres versus other countries in Europe? And that's definitely a challenge for us. Yeah.
And is that so? You mentioned speed just now. Do you think that speed issue is one of the main issues? And what are you seeing around that timescale issue with data centres? Because I hear various things. Like things like if you're not connected by 2030, that's it. You're out. I don't know what you're hearing.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of rhetoric around. It has to start with the 2020 something. Yeah, there's definitely that. If you look at the bigger data centre connections, they need 2 to 3 years to build and connect. So they're obviously looking for connections in 28, 29. Hopefully before 30. The data center market's quite varied. You've got your hyperscalers, you've got your mid 50 to 100 megawatts, and then you've got your micro ones as well. So each have a different demand and have different requirements for grid. So it is a T&D problem. At the certain levels in distribution, at the smaller end, they can be connected through probably the BAU process for connecting. But the bigger ones are grabbing that demand and there's a lack of capacity in the network. That's the problem. And if you add that to the connections reform and the renewable situation, it's even more challenging. So, and the ability for the industry to be agile to meet that demand is the challenge. But certainly from an investment perspective, we hear from data center customers that, they want to connect these before 2030. The challenge is in some cases it's not going to happen, So we've got to be realistic, but we need to change some of the rules to help these projects get connected. Yeah.
And I think one of the things you mentioned there is quite a good point, in that there is so much variation in demand projects. So even just within data centers, but also other types of demand, hydrogen and others as well. So coming up with that set of rules is going to be very challenging, and perhaps even more so than for renewables and connections reform, which we all know is very challenging.
Yeah, and it kind of reminds me of in the early days of the renewables, where you were connecting separate solar, separate battery, and then it became, can we co-locate those? And then there was green hydrogen for a while. It's kind of similar here, where you've got data centers, but they also need backup generation. So is it an OCGT? Can you use some battery? Can you use some other forms of generation? So you've got this co-location, or hybrid is the term at the moment, that is a challenge for the industry. How can you help customers like that connect? So it's not just a data center demand point.
And have you got any thoughts around what makes a viable, say, data center connection? Because that seems to be like, what Ofgem is starting to talk about now is in looking at sort of queue formation and so on within that demand space is viability. So do you have any thoughts around what might make a viable data center project?
I think in a perfect scenario, right, you can get grid within 3 to 4 years. The infrastructure costs are, not unreasonable is probably the wrong phrase, but depending where you want to connect in the UK will, of course, lead you to a certain level of infrastructure required. So, we know that data centres want to be close to London or the M4 corridor, but that is an area where grid capacity is really scarce, So you can see the data centre community now looking further out across the UK. You hear about AI growth zones. When will the government declare those? You hear about availability zones. That's the language from the data centres. And this is different to the connection reform, where you're thinking about first ready, network need, first served. Actually, this is a network point. This is where does the data centre need to be to minimise the latency delays, on the fibre network, as an example. So the viability, there's going to be, emerging already, there are availability zones around the country. And I think the government, the industry need to support those. And then how can you accelerate those connections for those data centre companies? And, of course, bring battery or backup generation as required. That's really going to drive it. The cost, it's a different kind of investment model to your renewables. So there is more flexibility, I think, with the data center community of how you connect. And also, if you're talking hyperscaler, they would also say, well, we'd be willing to own parts of the electricity network to get these connections made, And that's, we should consider all options, really. We do need Ofgem, DESNZ, DESNZ, NESO, etc. We need all these parties to come together to come up with some different solutions,
So what's the key problem with sort of, so for these larger transmission connections, where you may be 400 or 500 plus megawatts of demand, what are some of the key issues though in terms of that grid connection bit? Because I know there's issues with what sort of voltage level of network demand customers can build out and that sort of thing.
Yeah, because if you're trying to connect 400 or 500 megawatts of distribution, that's quite rare. So it's invariably going to be transmission. And then at that size, of course, you probably need grid infrastructure and significant costs there too. And then you're into a lead time of how quick can you build the infrastructure, which is a similar issue to large renewable connections. So that does lead you down. This is going to be 3, 4, 5 years plus before you can connect those big hyperscalers. For the mid region, for the data centers, it's a different discussion. But at transmission, you'll see it for the TO, NGET, England and Wales. They don't build out to the data center park, where Scotland, they will build out with SPT and shuttle. So you've got two solutions there. But, agility is the point here. The likes of NGET in England and Wales, because they don't build out, that means you've got some difficulties around the rules of owning networks. And that's the key issue here. I think that we could solve with some different ways of connecting.
Thank you for listening so far. If insights like these are valuable in your work, then feel free to subscribe and stay current as Britain's connections landscape continues to evolve. Now, back to the connectologists.
Yeah, and so there is that key issue with network ownership, isn't there? So the current licensing rules go: if you've got a generation license, you can own transmission level stuff, network.
Yeah.
But if you're a demand customer, you can only own distribution level kit, and so there's this mismatch at the moment.
Yeah, and the rules need to change around that. But also, if you think about the BCAs, the bilateral connection agreements, you can only have one legal entity at the end of a BCA, and we've seen it again in the connection reform. If you've got a bunch of batteries and solar farms, each have their own connection, but if they're owned by separate legal entities, you have to split the BCA. That is a problem that has been looked at. It's the same for data centres. If data centres need generation, the only way to have a single BCA is to put everything behind the meter. Now, technically that does work, but of course it does complicate it upstream for the grid companies. So there can be some rules similar to the reform that we could change to help data centres connect and own their own networks, either transmission or distribution. Yeah.
Mm. And so what are some of the solutions then, do you think? Because I know as Eclipse you've been exploring a particular option recently along that side of it.
Yeah, so we've explored two over the last few years, but the current one is a project we have called Future Point Manchester. So that's a co-development with Carlton Power, who are a long-term developer, been in the industry 20 plus years. And the project in Manchester is a project connecting into the NGET network, which is basically next door. There's no infrastructure required, but there's a small amount of transmission assets that we'd have to own as a private network. And our Secretary of State submission has gone in to say, look, we've got a net that we can build out. We can connect a data centre, renewables, battery, OCGT, and also serve smaller local industrial customer connections like electric HGV hubs. So it's essentially a gigapark. But the idea is, if we own that network, we can build this quicker and more cost effectively and adopt slightly different technical standards to enable those connections. And we think it's quite innovative. It's quite unique because there's no infrastructure work required. We have the land, we have the customers, we have the local support of the local MP, engagement with GMCA as an example, and all the stars have aligned for that project to proof of concept that actually we can do this as an industry. Yeah.
So the exemption is saying, can we as Eclipse own as effectively a 400 or 275 to 132 kV transformer?
Yeah.
And what, a short bit of cable or something into the main substation?
As your viewers have probably heard, it's an interpretation of the Electricity Act, wholly and mainly, yeah. And if you look at that network that would connect those customers, there's a short length of transmission line, less than a kilometre, and then there's some transformers, and then you're into a distribution network. So the view is this is wholly and mainly distribution. Now, there's two reasons why we've gone for a transmission licence exemption. One is it's more bankable for customers connecting, because it gives you certainty that this is license exempt, we can connect, etc. The second point is you could interpret this as a distribution network, but you've always got the view that at any point in time, government or Ofgem could say, well, we're not sure whether it is or not, and it becomes disallowed, let's say. So that's not as bankable. The second point here is we've designed tariffs for the customers that match local tariffs, so that's a real plus point, so they're market facing. And we're financing the build of this, and we recover those financing costs through the tariffs. So market-facing tariffs, there's no consumer burden as well, and you've no infrastructure costs with grid. So it's a really neat solution to help the customers connect quite quickly. And we have a supply chain kind of ready to go as well. So it's quite a neat solution. I think the key point is the tariffs make this work for customers. So of course, if we had tariffs that were more expensive, it wouldn't work for the customer. But the fact that when they're doing their benchmarking, they can go, well, this is the local tariff, this is our tariff, that's a tick box. And there's no infrastructure works from NGET, which means speed-wise, the critical path is down to us and the data centers to build it in time in 3 years, essentially.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like an interesting solution. I think everyone's really keen to see what comes out of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And do you see that kind of route where it's a very sort of site-specific, exemptions from the licenses being the future, or do you kind of envisage more, us kind of setting up something that's like a transmission network operator license?
Yeah, good question, Alex. So I think two things. There's always the danger of precedent, right? That's the first thing you get back. And we were in a workshop a few weeks ago with DESNZ and the whole industry, and we talked about that point. We did say, to be honest, and of course we would say it case by case. And the reason why I would say this is we have a small amount of transmission assets and the majority is distribution, so it fits the wholly and mainly. But with other connections, if it's mainly transmission, then can you be transmission license exempt? It might lead you to can we create independent transmission licenses? And we went through that 3-4 years ago with Ofgem. We didn't quite get to the final hurdle, but the concept was understood by the industry, NGET, NESO, and Ofgem at the time. And, we even wrote a paper on how would this market work, which was similar to IDNO, no surprise. So this could be another way to kind of solve the precedent question, where you're having last mile transmission connections, allowing customers to connect more quickly and be more in control of their connections, rather than waiting for the TOs, etc., to build out when the TOs have got such a high volume of work. That's the other challenge. Yeah.
And I guess the other thing about TOs building out, and I know you've come across this as well, Alex, is just that the discrepancy there is between England and Wales and Scotland in the way that they do things differently.
Yes, yeah. So, like we talked about before, the transmission companies build out the network to you in Scotland, and it's very different in England and Wales. But also in terms of the kind of wider works and reinforcements, to do with the SQSS and demand connections, they are a bit more stringent than for some generator connections.
Yeah, that's true. So we should never forget SQSS, and I think the point there is, if it's Future Point Manchester, there's no infrastructure work required, that's great. But if there's another connection that needs to have major infrastructure works, which links to reconducting overhead lines, that's going to take a long time. So you haven't got the advantage there. And this is why, the point, going back to case by case, it won't suit every scenario. So I think the license exempt suits some scenarios. I think an ITO license would suit others, certainly for the developers that we work with. And if you think of where the developers' mindset might be, they're also saying, well, we're more agile, we can build quicker and more cost effectively than the electricity entities. So, and that's true, but of course, making sure we meet the standards is also very important. Yeah.
And do you see any role, because another option some people have talked about is the government producing a demand license, like similar to the generation license. And do you see that as a potential route, or would that just take forever because it's government licensing and electricity acts and all that sort of business?
Yeah, that would be another great option. Yeah, if we could make it happen quick enough. Yeah. And particularly I think for, let's say, hyperscalers who have large 500 megawatts plus, if given the level of investment involved in those data centers, the cost of grid is a much smaller cost in the scheme of things, although it's critical because you need to get that connection built. So if there was the opportunity for large demands to have their demand license, just like that's got to be a solution. It has to be, and owning their own networks on the basis of they are the only customer connecting, I guess. But to be honest, then you go back to what else might they have behind the meter as well, because they still need backup generation, but it will be their own backup generation and everything else. So yeah, I definitely see that as a solution. It's how quick can we make it happen? Yeah.
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 I think it feels like we're sort of coming towards the end of the conversation on this. Not that there isn't anything else to talk about, but just time is ticking away. But if we were to sort of wind the clock forward 6 months, what would sort of Eclipse's view be on what the things that you would have liked to have changed within 6 months?
Yeah, I think, in 6 months, of course, we'd like to see Future Point Manchester start to be designed and built. Yeah. I think in terms of the industry, I would want to have seen and it's been really good because if you look at connections reform, it's taken a while to get here. It's here now. We're right in the middle of it and things are happening. So that's great to see. Can we do that more quickly for demand? So as an industry in July next year, before we take our holidays, led by the industry, Ofgem, DESNZ, etc., and NESO, we have a solution for connecting demand. We've prioritised them. We've changed the rules that allow them to connect more quickly. We've looked at all the various different options, and we've gone, yes, we can do, ITO, we can do transmission license exempt. Some things in the pipeline now for demand licenses. That will be a great result in 6 months, and it's very possible because I've certainly seen in the last 2 or 3 months the pace the industry's moved on reforming the queue for renewables. And it's one of those things, utilities are really good when there's an emergency, right? It's an emergency. Yeah. Come on, we can do this. Yeah. That's what I'd like to see, Yeah.
And I guess the final question is, have you got any view as to who actually owns that process? Because I know you were in that sort of meeting a few weeks back. I think, Ofgem was there, NESO, DESNZ, industry developers and so on, and sort of, like yourselves as well.
It's an interesting one because when we started on our path with Future Point Manchester, we thought, well, we need to speak to everybody, yeah? But that takes effort. And exactly that question, who does make the decision? And we did quickly got to, this has to go to Secretary of State. That was the first point. But of course, the Secretary of State is going to ask DESNZ, Ofgem, NESO, etc. I'm seeing more and more that DESNZ seem to be leading on some of these policy issues, which is fantastic to see. The industry does need some leadership here. But it'd be great to see that Ofgem, DESNZ, NESO are really working closely together in a combined effort. Personally, I'm not too bothered who leads on that, but because they've all got a long list of things they need to solve. But whichever one provides the leadership, let's do that, because it is hard to say who's making the decision, and it feels like you have to everybody to get a decision. And decision by committee is really tough. Yeah.
Yeah. So. Or it falls in that black hole.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Brilliant. Spencer, Alex, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. It's been brilliant to talk through. Thank you everyone for listening as well. And we do hope you will join us for the next podcast. Thanks very much and goodbye.
Thanks for joining the Connectologists in this exploration. This knowledge sharing is made possible by the support of our clients. We thank them and hope it will help the whole of industry to connect society's critical infrastructure faster. If you found this useful, you're welcome to explore more free insights at roadnighttaylor.co.uk/connectology or click on the Insights tab at the top of our homepage. Thank you.